Dave Gokdana August Falchigadi a cut of Brev. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Brehan Academy. My name is Kim Flanagan. In this video, you're going to get a front row seat at one of the most pivotal battles in Irish history. We're going to follow the journey of the Dalkasians through a great king called Brian Boru and learn his story of how he united several, not all, but several of the Irish clans in opposition of the Vikings and finally pushed them back in the Battle of Clontarf in 1014. But before we get into that, if you're a fan of Irish heritage and culture, you're in the right place because that's everything we do here. The purpose of the Breton Academy is to revive an awareness and appreciation for the culture, the mythology, and the laws of early Ireland. So if that sounds like something that you're interested in and you'd like to see more, please click subscribe and hit the notification bell so you get notified whenever I upload a new video. Not just here on YouTube, of course. I invite you to check out the bretonacademy.org if you want to get access to some articles and online courses and a really cool, if I do say so myself, members library, which has a ton of resources, PDF books that are available for free download to members. So even this book that we're going to cover this evening is available there. And of course, we also have an online store. So if you want to check that out, see if anything takes your fancy, it'd be much appreciated. Now, we're going to continue our journey into the story of an Irish Sept. This is part 6. And for this video, I've decided to do something a little bit differently. My brother is a Viking reenactor, has been for many, many years, well over a decade. And he's a very good fighter. And there was a Viking reenactment of the Battle of Clontarf in 2014, which would have been the millennial celebration, which my brother fought at. And so instead of using old pictures and drawings from books and images like that, what I've decided to do is just use photographs from the reenactment of the Battle of Clontarf. So Seamus MacNamara is continuing his journey now with the story of Brian Boru and his great victory at Clontarf, but also his sad demise that happened on the same day. The story of an Irish Sept, Chapter 6. In the previous chapter, it was explained how the Dalkasian tribe originated from Cormac Cos and came to occupy the territory now known as County Clare, and that before these people could obtain possession of Thomond, they had to drive out the King of Connacht and to conquer its Firbolg's inhabitants. Conall, the son of Luad, died about the year 419. He left a son named Cas, who became Prince of Thomond and Chief of the Dalkas. Cas had 12 sons, and from the eldest came the family of the O'Briens. Cas's second son was called Cashan, and from him were derived the Sept of MacNamara's or Clan Cullen. It is not, however, until long after the time of Cas that the monarch of Ireland, Brian Boru, gave surnames to the principal families of Ireland with the object of, quote, avoiding confusion and that their genealogies might be better preserved, end quote. The family name given to the members of Clan Cullen was MacNamara or MacNamara. Until Brian's time, men's names, as a rule, were derived from some peculiarity of their features, not unfrequently from some marked trait in their character, as already described in the case of Ulil Ullum. At the time Cas became chief of the Dalkasians, the tribe had obtained complete possession of Thomond, and as his sons grew up, the 4 eldest were assigned lands according to their priority. Cashan, the second son of Cos, had a portion of land assigned to him between the rivers Fergus and Shannon. It extended some 17 Irish miles from north to south and 16 from east to west. This territory is marked on all old maps of Ireland as U Cashan, or the tribal lands of Cashan. And in the footnotes, the name and exact extent of this territory is preserved in the deanery of Ogaskin, which comprises the parishes of Kim, Tulla, Clooney, Dora, Kilratis, Temple Mali, Kilmurry na Gall, and Inchicronan. After AD 1318, Ucashin included, in addition to the above parishes, those of Killaloe, Aglish, Killurin, Kilnoe, Killokennedy, Tulla, Moynoe, Kilseely, Fiacla, Kilfinity, Inishcaltra, Tomgraney, in short, the whole of Upper and Lower Tulla. Returning to the text, Cashin therefore was the immediate progenitor of the Sept of MacNamara's in the same way as Cormac Cos was of the tribe of Dalkasians. From the time of Cormac, the office of chief of the tribe had passed in unbroken succession through 7 generations from chief to Tanist, Cas being the last of the 7. The territories conquered by Cas's father and grandfather were of sufficient extent to allow him to divide them among his sons as tribe lands, and in this way the area we know as County Clare came to be subdivided among the members of this Celtic tribe. As time went on, the 4 eldest sons of Cashin migrated from their father's house and had lands assigned them within the boundaries of Ucashin, under the provisions of the Brehon laws. On referring to the pedigree in chapter 19 of this volume, it will be noticed that from Cashin to Shielda, the names of 8 chiefs are given who respectively held the office of head of the Clan Cullen Sept. During the 3 centuries in which these chiefs exercised authority over their sept, we hear but little of Clare, for this part of Ireland seems to have enjoyed a period of peace and prosperity, which was only seriously broken by the invasion of the Danes in the 9th century. But it is evident that throughout the time that County Clare had no history, the chiefs of Clan Cullen maintained their position as second in rank to the head of the O'Briens, who were successively kings of Thomond. For in the year AD 847 we find the chief of our sept filling an important post as marshal of the province. It then fell to the lot of Shielda MacNamara to inaugurate the head of his tribe as king of North Munster or Thomond. The office of marshal, we are told, quote, was a highly honourable one and was hereditary, end quote. And so far as the province of Thomond was concerned, it was held for many generations by the head of our sept. The ceremony of inauguration took place at Magadar, situated within the Ucashin tribal lands, upon the mound under which the last of the Firbolg chiefs of Clare were buried. From a drawing made by Mr. T.J. Westrop, the existing appearance of this mound is clearly shown. On the day of inauguration, the heads of the various Dalkasian septs assembled around Magadar. The king-elect, his chief bard, and the head of the MacNamara sept then ascended the mound. The king-elect stood on the stone placed near its centre. His bard then recited certain laws which the chief promised to obey. The chief of Clan Cullen then handed the king-elect a straight white wand, a symbol of authority and an emblem of what his conduct should be: straight and without stain. The king promised to maintain the prestige and the customs of his tribe, and having put aside his sword and other weapons, and holding the wand in his hand, he moved round the stone so as to view his territory from all sides, which he promised to protect from invasion. The marshal then, in a loud voice, proclaimed the chief's surname, and declared him to be king of Thomond. From the footnotes, Mr. Westrop states that Magadar consists of a large, flat-topped mound, 20 feet high, surrounded by a low fosse, across which, to the west, leads an inclined way 8 paces long, shown in the sketch. To the north side of the platform is a grave-like hollow lying east and west, while near the centre is a rough and weather-worn stone nearly level with the ground. Returning to the text, Edmund Spencer states that the Tanist was elected to the office in the same manner as the chief, but only placed 1 foot upon the stone and then took the same oath as his captain. It is stated in the Black Book of Christ Church, Dublin, that the kings of Ireland were neither ordained nor anointed, but were kings by election and by the right of arms. In the year AD 847, a chief named Lachna ruled over Thomond, and an individual called Flann was at the time king and also abbot and bishop of South Munster. Unmindful of the fact that the Dalkas were exempt from paying tribute either to the monarch of Ireland or to Munster, Flann nevertheless demanded payment and submission from Lachna, which was refused, whereupon Phelim marched an army against Thomond and encamped on the eastern bank of the Shannon. Lachna desired peace and assembled his chiefs, including Melchutta, who at that period was the head of Clan Cullen. They determined to resist the demand for tribute, and against the advice of their king wished to resort to arms in defence of their rights. Thereupon Lachta disguised himself, and proceeding to Flann's camp he obtained an audience with the King of Munster, and came to an amicable agreement with him. The chief of Thomond then returned home, but in the meantime Phelim's mind had been poisoned by a sage who had consulted on the subject of the negotiations which he had been engaged in, and having been persuaded to distrust Lachna, he sent off a messenger in hot haste to recall that chief to his camp. On receiving this message, Lachna at once retraced his steps. And when Flann saw his good faith, he felt full confidence in the chief of Thomond, and as a token of regard, gave him his own steed and robes. Flann, we are told, also gave his blessing to Lachna, which, as Mr. T.J. Westrop observes, could hardly have been accounted of much importance, as this king and bishop had just previously attacked and robbed the churches of Clonmacnoise, Armagh, Durrow and Kildare, and put their clergy to the sword. Lachna was succeeded by his son Lorcan as king of Thomond. This chief was foster son to and Tanist of Cormac Maclonnan, who at the time was king of South Munster and archbishop of Cashel. Cormac visited Lorcan, and amongst other good advice is said to have, quote, impressed upon him the importance of religious education for children. End quote. Flann was at this period, quote, monarch of Ireland, and having demanded tribute from the Dalkas, which they again refused, he invaded Thomond and entered the Dalkasians' territory in AD 877. The monarch's bard, Maclonnan, warned him to be careful not to insult the Dalkasians. End quote. Flann, however, marched into Clare and pitched his camp on the sacred mound of Magadder, and having challenged one of his followers to chess, they sat down to the game, which he was hardly allowed time to finish. For Siada MacNamara, chief of Clan Cullen, followed by Lorcan with a strong force, attacked Flann. The king, however, escaped with some of his followers into the neighbouring forests, but after 3 days fighting he had to surrender to Lorcan and Siada MacNamara, who treated Flann courteously, fed his followers abundantly, and then escorted him on his way homewards across the Shannon. After treatment of this kind, it is no wonder that Flann's poet Maclonnan wrote in praise of the Dalkasians. A prose verse of this poem will be found at the end of the chapter, and Professor O'Curry considers it as being authentic, among other reasons because Maclonnan pays a particular compliment to Siada on Eich Bui, that is, Siada of the Bay Steed, the chief of Clan Cullen, and to his son Esidia, who was young at this time. They were two well-known personages in our sept about the date of the poet's death, which took place in the year AD 918. Mr. Westrop refers to a trait in Lorcan's character which is worth preserving. As already remarked, the King of South Munster had made Lorcan his Tanist, and the two were evidently on the most friendly terms. Upon a certain occasion, however, Lorcan proceeded to Cashel to visit his friend, but on arriving there he declined to enter the place until the king sent him a formal invitation to come and see him. It is by casual reference to incidents of this kind that we obtain a peep into the character of some of these early Celtic chiefs. From the footnote, Matthew Arnold remarks that Irish men are distinguished by an organism quick to feel impressions and feeling them strongly, a lively personality therefore, keenly sensitive to joy and sorrow. Strong perception and emotions are to the soul what the senses are to the body. It means genius. But sensitiveness must not be allowed with impunity to master the mind. Balance, measure, and patience are necessary, and these the Celt does not possess. He is ever chafing against the despotism of facts, straining under the effects of emotion, eager to enlist in the fray, but always to fall. Returning to the text, the historian Keating informs us that on certain occasion Cormac Maclonnan had determined to hold a great feast at Cashel. He sent messages to his chiefs to provide the necessary contributions, but they declined to comply with this request, although many of them were near of kin to the king. End quote. The Dalkas, hearing this, prepared with all possible speed what provisions were necessary, together with horses, equipages, arms and jewels, and sent them to the King of Munster. Cormac received these presents with sincere gratitude, which he expressed in verse. Keating, writing of this period, observes that the great prosperity of the people of Ireland towards the close of the 8th century led many of them to adopt corrupt manners, vice, and profaneness, principally among the landowners, from which they were suddenly roused by the cruel hand of the Danes. The two first expeditions which the Danes made into the west of Ireland took place in AD 795 and 801, and were both repulsed by the Irish. But from 812 to 835, a vast number of Scandinavians flocked into Ireland, pillaging the churches and committing every conceivable cruelty on the inhabitants of that country. At this period and for some time previously, there had been incessant fighting among the ecclesiastics of Armagh for the office of abbot. The inhabitants of this monastery of Clonmacnoise and Durrow were also frequently at war with one another. Turgesius, the leader of the Norsemen, made short work of these ecclesiastics, for he drove them out of their establishments. And we are told that the abbot of Armagh fled, taking with him the shrine of St. Patrick to a district in Thomond east of the Shannon, which was inhabited by the Martini, a Freebolg tribe, who lived as a separate people under their own chief at Emly, County Tipperary, as late as the 9th century. Turgesius was the acknowledged king of the north of Ireland. He hoped to establish a strong government and so to overcome the discord and anarchy which existed in the country. He also desired to banish Christianity from Ireland, and he placed his wife to rule over Clonmacnoise. We are told that she was accustomed to preside at the high altar of the principal church of the monastery and work the oracles of her religion from that position. In the year AD 879, the Irish rose against Turgesius, and having killed him, drove most of his followers out of Erin. The invaders soon returned in greater numbers than before and overran the whole country. Kennedy, son of Lorcan, was at this time king of Thomond, and Kalahan king of Munster. The Norsemen were anxious to obtain possession of these chiefs, but rather than attack Munster, they hoped to entice Kalahan to Dublin under false pretences and then make him a prisoner. Sitrick, therefore, who was leader of the Norsemen, entered into negotiations with the King of Munster, proposing to give his sister in marriage. Kennedy, King of Thomond, hearing what was going on and suspecting treachery, warned Kalahan of the danger of leaving his province, and especially of withdrawing from it any large body of followers to swell his train in Dublin. Kalahan therefore set out with few retainers to bring his intended wife home, and among this force was Kennedy's son, Duncan. The cavalcade had nearly reached Dublin when they were attacked by Sitrick's soldiers and made prisoners. Directly Kennedy heard of this treachery, he assumed command of the forces of Munster as well as those of Thomond to revenge the insult offered to Kalahan and, if possible, to release him and also his own son from the hands of the Danes. Keating records the fact that, quote, Kennedy resolved to prosecute his designs with the greatest dispatch, and he raised, in addition to his other forces, a body of 500 Dalkasians, placed them under the command of Essida MacNamara, chief of Clan Cullen. End quote. Everything being ready and a fleet having started from Limerick for Dundalk, to which place Sitrick had removed his prisoners, the army of Thomond marched for that port. On the approach of the Irish forces, Sitrick took the prisoners on board his vessel which lay in the bay of Dundalk, so that when the Irish arrived they could do no more than stand on the shore and curse their enemies. Before long, however, they saw their own fleet, which had been sent from the Shannon, entering the harbour, and the Irish vessels at once closed with the Norsemen. the commander of the Irish ran his ship alongside that of Sitrix, boarded her, sword in hand. He then endeavoured to force his way to the mast of the vessel, to which Kalahan and Kennedy's son were bound, but he was slain. One of his followers, however, seized Sitrick round the body and jumped overboard with him. They were both drowned. On realising what had occurred, the Norsemen became disheartened. Kalahan and Duncan were released and arrived safely among their friends on shore. Turning to the footnote, General Valeny and some other authorities question the truth of this incident, but it is not only vouched for by Keating, who has exceptional opportunities for studying all that relates to the history of Munster, but the details he has given bear internal evidence of truth. For instance, Maclonnan refers to Shiada and his son Essida in a poem I have quoted, and O'Curry states Essida, about the year 918, was quite young. Consequently, we can easily understand how Kennedy might have chosen him in 954 to command a contingent of the Dalkasians in the army sent to release his son and the King of Munster from the Norsemen. Returning to the text, Kalahan was succeeded by Mahon, son of Kennedy, the Dalkasian chief of Thomond. The west of Ireland from the year AD 890 was overrun with Norsemen who, we are informed, occupied the homes of the Irish, so that the owners had not even power to give milk or eggs to a sick or infirm man. The foreigners claimed the right over everything. The Norsemen were far better armed than the native Irish, who at the time were utterly unable to withstand them. It was in circumstances of this kind that Mahon and his brother Brian, the sons of Kennedy, appeared on the scene. From its geographical position, and in consequence of the dense woods which covered its hills and plains, Clare was not so completely occupied by the Norsemen as in other parts of Ireland. At any rate, from the account given in the Wars of the Gael with the Gaul, we learn that Mahon and Brian were the greater part of the Dalkasians living to the east and south of the Shannon, crossed the river into Clare so as to escape from the invaders of their country, and they, quote, dispersed themselves among the forest and woods situated between Lough Derg and the Fergus, end quote, or, in other words, over the MacNamara territories. From this locality the Irish proceeded to sally forth and kill all the foreigners they could lay their hands on. The effect of these tactics were to compel the Norsemen to concentrate their forces on the Shannon, where they built a fort in the district of Traig, which at that time belonged to Irish Sept and was subsequently the site of the Anglo-Norman castle of Bunratty. In these operations, Brian Boru's forces suffered fearfully from constant fighting and want of food, and Mahon, hearing of his brother's desperate condition, sent for him, and at the meeting which took place between them, Mahon argued in favour of submission to the Norsemen, for he had given up all hope of returning to govern in Cashel. From the old Celtic records we learn that Brian expressed great indignation at sentiments of this kind and even accused his brother of cowardice. He taunted Mahon by asking him if he thought their father or grandfather would have made peace, while an enemy occupied Ireland. Mahon admitted all this, but argued that if they had not the power to resist the invader, it was useless holding out against the foe. He asked Brian if he wished to see the whole of his tribe in the same state as his own followers. To this Brian replied, quote, that such an argument was bad because it was hereditary for him to die, and for the whole of the Dalkas likewise. As their fathers had passed away, so must they. But it was not natural or hereditary for the Dalkas to submit to insult or contempt. Their forefathers had never submitted to this, and no power on earth would make him do so. End quote. The tribe, on hearing this, assembled to resist the invaders and met them at Sulcott in Tipperary. In this battle the Norsemen were defeated and fled to Limerick, which Brian took and destroyed its fortifications, inflicting great loss and injury on the enemy in AD 968. This victory added so much to the prestige of the Dalkasians that their rivals, the Owenites, grew jealous of them, and at the instigation of Molloy, chief of Desmond, they treacherously murdered Maclonnan in AD 976. Brian Boru was not slow to avenge his brother's death. He first sent a challenge to Malloy to meet him in single combat, and directed his messenger to add that nothing short of the death of one of them would suffice. Receiving no satisfactory answer, Brian marched his forces into South Munster and met Malloy. A battle ensued, in which the latter chief was killed by one of Brian's sons. From the annals of Inishfallen, we learn that in the year AD 977, Brian Boru, assisted by Eald MacNamara, chief of Clan Cullen, stormed the island of Scattery, driving the Danes who had found refuge there to their ships and completely clearing the district of Thomond of their enemies. Brian Boru was now proclaimed King of Munster, but Malachy, who at the time was King of Leinster, seeing the rising power of Brian, determined to demonstrate his own supremacy as monarch of the country. He therefore marched an army into Clare and pitched his camp on Magadair. He uprooted the sacred oak tree which grew on this mound in AD 982. From the footnotes, Brian received the name Boru or Boriva because he revived the payment of the tribute or tax known as the Borromean tribute in former times, and which had been abolished since AD 680. Returning to the text, we can readily understand the indignation among the Dalkasians produced by this act, for among other things the ceremony of inauguration of the King of Thomond and Magadair demonstrated the fact that the tribe had a right to elect their own king. It was therefore incumbent on Brian to retaliate on Malachy. After continued fighting, it was determined by these chiefs to divide the sovereignty of Thomond. But constant feuds sprang up between the rival kings, and in the end Malachy solicited and obtained the help of the Danes of Dublin. They combined forces, Irish and Danish, met those under Brian Boru at a place called Glenmanna. In the battle which ensued, Brian was victorious. He then sacked Dublin, carrying off to his home at Kincora, Killaloe, a vast quantity of treasure. Brian Boru now determined to rule Ireland, and Malachy ultimately went to his camp and submitted to him as being the more powerful of the two. Malachy retained his position, however, as King of Leinster, but Brian Boru, the Dalkasian chief, was acknowledged as supreme ruler over the whole country in AD 1002, with the other provincial kings paying him tribute. Brian received tribute also from the Danes of Dublin in the form of 150 butts of wine, from the inhabitants of Limerick a ton of wine per diem. He received a vast number of cattle from every part of the country. For instance, the chiefs of Burren, Orcam Row sent tribute of 2,000 cattle and 1,000 sheep, and so with the other parts of Ireland. The order of the various kings and chiefs at Brian's table has come down to us and was scrupulously followed. Behind the seat of each chief his arms were suspended. The tables, we are told, were covered with gold-mounted cups. The food consisted of beef, mutton, pork, game, fish, oatcakes, cheese, curds, onions and watercress. Wine, beer and mead, together with the bilberry juice, constituted their drink. The meat appears to have been cooked in the dining hall. Brian Boru in the year 1004 made a circuit through the whole of Ireland, and while at Armagh he confirmed its bishop as metropolitan of the country. The record of this fact, written by O'Carroll, Brian Boru's former tutor and subsequent chief advisor, was made in the presence of the king and still exists in a copy of the scriptures preserved in the library of the Royal Irish Academy. Before leaving Armagh, Brian laid 20 ounces of gold as an offering on the altar of St. Patrick. After 40 years of more or less strife, Brian Boru at length found himself so securely seated on the throne of Ireland that he was able to turn his attention to developing the resources of the country. Kincora became its capital. its chief buildings being near the Clare side of the Shannon, at the head of the wooden bridge which then crossed the river. The houses were built of timber and clay and extended along the river bank for some distance. Near the river there were two churches, the one stone-roofed, which still exists to the north of the cathedral. On the summit of the hill above the bridge stood the palace, surrounded by numerous buildings, which was the chief place of residence of Brian Boru and his descendants for many years. Brian's rest and Ireland's peace, however, did not long continue. For political purposes he thought it wise to make an alliance with the Danes, hoping in this way to promote the harmony of the contending influences under his rule. He therefore married the mother of Sitric, the leader of the Danes of Dublin. This individual, whose name was Gormflaith, had previously married first Sitric's father and then the King of Leinster, but they both became weary of Gormflaith and turned her off. She then fell to the lot of Brian. He also soon cast off his spouse, but permitted her to remain in the palace at Kincora. To this place her brother, Maelmolda, came bringing with him a present for Brian, consisting of 3 masts for his ships. These were carried on men's shoulders, and in crossing a bog the bearers came to grief, whereupon Maelmolda applied his own shoulder to the work, and in doing so tore off one of the silver buttons of his gold-braided silken tunic, which had been presented to him on a former occasion by Brian. On the arrival of Maelmolda at Kincora, he went to his sister Gormflaith and asked her to replace this button, but she snatched the garment from his hands and threw it onto the fire, reproaching him for wearing a garment which was a token of submission to Brian Boru. Maelmolda, while stinging under this taunt, happened to see Murrough, Brian's son, playing at chess with another chief. He suggested a move which lost Murrough the game. Irritated by this, Murrough turned on Maelmolda and remarked, quote, "That, like the advice you gave your friend at Glenmama, it lost the battle." End quote. Maelmolda replied, "I will give them advice now, and they will not be defeated a second time." To which Murrough replied, "Have a yew tree ready on that occasion." After the battle above referred to, Maelmolda had been discovered hiding among the branches of a yew tree. Maelmolda left Kincora next morning in great anger and made his way to Dublin. He was followed by his sister, who incited the Danes to revolt, and they were joined by a considerable force of the natives of Ireland and their countrymen from the Isle of Man, Britain and Wales. Canute, King of England, was only too ready to help in the struggle, hoping to establish his countrymen in Ireland as he had done in England. Sitric took command of the Confederate forces. Brian Boru, although in his 73rd year of age, was still vigorous enough to make the necessary arrangements to meet his enemies, and he determined to stake his cause and that of his country on the issue of the impending battle. Brian, however, felt it was beyond his power to do more than collect and take his army into the field. For a commander in those days had not only to lead his men, but also to fight hand to hand in the thick of battle, especially at weak points. Brian therefore wisely left the command of his army in the hands of his son Murrough. Every man of Brian's family marched with his army, among them his grandson Turlough, a youth of some 16 years of age, who was his father's standard bearer. These leaders were surrounded by Dalkasians. Among them, Keating tells us, there marched with Brian to Clontarf, quote, the children of Cass, son of Connell, of the Fleet Steed, the Clan Cullens, MacNamaras, around Menma, son of Ead, son of Endu, son of Essida, son of Shielda, son of Maelhuer. End quote. Keating, with his usual precision, identifies the leader of Clan Cullen so that there can be no mistake about him, and on referring to the family pedigree we find that Menma was chief of the Sept around the year 1014, when the Battle of Clontarf was fought. From the annals of the Four Masters we learn that Menma, Lord of Ucashan, died AD 1015, so that he was one of the few Dalkasian chiefs who survived the Battle of Clontarf. On the morning of Good Friday, April 23rd, 1014, the Irish army took up their position on the field of battle. They consisted of the Dalkasians in the van, led by Morrow, the centre composed by the men of South Munster, and the rear by those of Connacht. The Danes under Sitrick and their Irish allies formed a line extending along the shore of Clontarf with their backs to the sea. Many of the Danes were clad in armour, but the Irish were dressed in their linen tunics and armed with their usual weapons: spear, sword, and axe. No horsemen were engaged on either side, and each army numbered about 20,000 men. There seems to have been no attempt at tactics. Every man fought for himself, the rear taking the place of those in front who were killed. The first to meet were the Dalkasians and the Danes, and so from early morning to sunset the battle was carried on without interruption. Towards evening the Irish made a final effort and carried all before them. The Danes were completely vanquished, and with their allies fled from the field of battle. The old monarch, Brian Boru, although unable to lead his army, watched its movements from a distance throughout the day. We are told that his attention was constantly fixed on the standard of his son, Morrow. For so long as he saw it carried aloft, he felt sure that all was well with the Irish. Towards evening, Morrow's banner disappeared. At first, Brian tried to persuade himself that it was his faulty sight and anxious watching that prevented him from recognizing his son's standard. But when the truth came home to him, the old man's grief was extreme. He could no longer watch the contest, but went into the tent his attendants had prepared for him to give vent to his sorrow in secret. It is stated that his attendants urged him to retire from the scene, but Brian replied, "Retreat becomes us not, and I know that I shall not leave this place alive, for Abel of Craig Leah appeared to me last night and told me that I should be killed this day." Soon after this the Danes fled in all directions, and Brian's servants, seeing this, left the old king and joined their comrades in pursuit of their enemies. The king was thus alone, and at this moment a party of fugitive Danes come upon his tent. Brian was recognised, and though he did his best to defend himself, the old man was soon overpowered and killed. From the footnote, the account of the Battle of Clontarf as given in the Icelandic Sagas, Volume 3, translated by Sir G. W. Dasent, is as follows. Quote, "When the Earl Segard came to Ireland, he and King Sitrick marched with that host to meet Brian the King of Ireland, and their meeting was on Good Friday. Then it fell out that there was no one left to bear the raven banner, and the Earl bore it himself, and fell there, but King Sitrick fled. King Brian fell, with victory and glory." Returning to the text, Morrow, after fighting throughout the whole of the day, towards the evening found his hands so swollen that he was unable any longer to grasp his sword. When in this condition he was attacked by a Dane, and the two closed with each other. Morrow was said by main force to have pulled the armour off his antagonist, and then to have felled him to the ground. The Dane at this moment drew his dagger and inflicted a wound in Morrow's side, from which he died on the following day. Young Turlough O'Brien fought by his father with great vigour, and after Morrow was wounded, Turlough seems to have pursued a Dane who rushed before him into the river, where the lad's body was found, his hands entangled in the long hair of his enemy. There is reason to believe that not less than a quarter of the Irish army were left dead on the field of Clontarf, and among their number were included very many Dalkasian and other chiefs. The result of this action, however, was the complete annihilation of the power of the Danes in Ireland, a power they never again attempted to regain. Donna O'Brien, another son of Brian Boru, who, previous to the Battle of Clontarf, had been directed by his father to proceed with a body of troops into Leinster, returned after the battle and took command of the remnant of the Dalkasians. Wounded and worn, these men were not to be allowed to return home in peace, for the King of Ossory, having a grudge against the Dalkas, refused to permit them to cross his territory. Donna determined nevertheless to march on into Thomond, and drew up his men to resist those of Ossory. He directed the wounded to be sent to the rear, but they begged to be allowed to die fighting with their comrades. So weak were many of these Dalkasians that they were unable to stand without support. Donna therefore had stakes driven into the ground against which his wounded warriors might lean for support, and, with a sound man on each side of a wounded one, they stood prepared to receive their enemies. We are told that the King of Ossory, when he learned what was taking place in the Dalkasian camp, thought it imprudent to further resist men of this stamp, and so the Dalkasians were allowed to pass on into their own territory. As already stated, there is every reason to believe that MacNamara, who had survived the Battle of Clontarf, was one of the chiefs with Donna O'Brien on this memorable occasion. The prose version of Maclonnan's poem, AD 877. Lorcan of Lochdarg, in whom there is no shadow of deceit, generous and hospitable to all. Flann, King of Ireland, said, "Fortunate it is, Maclonnan, that thou hast arrived. Reach me the chessboard." Flann, with warlike purpose, had come to Magadar. On the fertile plain he had arrived. I forthwith dispatched my foster son to Lachnason and to his heroes, rehearsing to them our demands and conditions of peace. They, in reply, dispatched their cavalry. So great was their number that earth trembled, and the clouds of heaven reverberated with the shouts and their greatness. Our followers fled. There was not one of all the horses of our cavalry left on the fair plains of Adar. Sheada of the Bay Steed took 200 horses per man. We thought it a hard case that he, single-handed, took all from us. He surrounded us from the south and did us much mischief. He came round us from the north and set us trembling, so that our forces gave way. Flann from Tara's halls, the king of banquets, said, "O Maclonnan, for friendship's sake, claim from Sheada his bay steed." Forthwith I went and addressed Sheada, the free and pure. "Wherefore dost thou come, Maclonnan?" said Sheada. I replied to the prince, the fierce warrior of the Gael. "To solicit the bay steed, sir, I have come." "Hearken," said Sheada, "O Maclonnan, since thou art a man of verse, the bay steed of handsome crest have I long ridden. It has before now been my lot to put in a good year on foot. I shall do brave deeds without him." "For Sheada be the black horse saddled," cried the poet in great excitement. "Flann will make in exchange for a bay, a black one." Bay were all their steeds after that. The horror of death was in their weapons, though all the world had been at stake. Yet Sheada maintained his friendship for me. 3 days and 3 nights was the host westward on chilly Magadar, without food, sleep, or store, neither resting nor departing. "Ask protection for us, Maclonnan," said Flann, "from the men of Dalkas, from the men of Limerick. Surely they are generous and will grant our request." I rise up and reach the despoiling Dalkasians, and forthwith I recite a poem to the best men on earth. After that I urge my petition on the Dalkas, to the people of Limerick, to allow Flann and all along with him to go in safety. Righteous protection was given us, and guides to show us the way until we reach the Shannon, and from its fords to Tara. The Dalkasians, the best of all people in the land of Alba and of Erin, it was by them, without fail, that quarter was given to their enemies. To the Dalkasians of the clans has been granted the bounty, the valour of Erin, and every good between heaven and earth has been bestowed on their chief, Lorcan. An appendix to Chapter 6. Lugard Delba, the fire producer, who was a druid, had 6 sons and 1 daughter called Aoife, and she married Trad, who was a kingly chief and druid, but without much land. After a time, this pair found themselves the possessors of a numerous family. Accordingly, Trad said to his wife, "Go thou and ask a favour of thy father. It would be well for us and our children to get more land." Aoife, therefore, went and asked her father to grant her a favour. Then Lugard consulted his oracles and said to his daughter, "If thou should order any one to leave his country now, he must depart without delay." "Depart thou then," said she, "and leave us the land thou inheritest, that it may be our property." Whereupon we are told that Lugard, her father, immediately complied, and with his sons left the lands and assigned them to Trad and his daughter. Professor O'Curry remarks, quote, "I may add that this territory, even at the present day, retains the name of Trad, forming, as it does, the deanery of Traig, in the present barony of Bunratty, County Clare, a tract which comprises 7 districts in which there are the ruins of 5 churches built by the MacNamaras. It was in this district that Rathfollen and Ballinacragga were situated, which were subsequently owned by the ancestors of the writer of this history. To proceed, however, with the story of Druid Lugard. Having been thus deprived of his property, he crossed the Shannon with his sons and cattle and passed into the southwest of Westmeath. On arriving at a certain cairn, we are told he built an altar and on it placed wood, which he ignited by his druidic power. From this fire there burst 5 streams of flame in 5 different directions, and the druid commanded his 5 elder sons to follow one each of the fiery streams, assuring them that they would lead them to their future inheritance. One of these sons remained near his father. His name was Nos, and he possessed a field on which his swine fed, and on this spot was subsequently built the famous monastery of Clonmacnoise. Clonmacnoise meaning the field of the hogs of Nos. In the 5th century, therefore, we find the people continued to believe in oracles, or soothsaying, and in the production of magical fire by the Druids, who, as will be observed by the references made in the legend, were not an exclusive caste, but formed a part of the Dalkasian tribe. This legend is moreover valuable in that it gives an idea of the social conditions under which these ancient members of Clan Cullen came into possession of their tribal lands, and further bears witness to the firm belief which still existed among them regarding the influence possessed by the Druids. The legend is in itself not more marvellous than those related of St. Kieran, who was a neighbour and contemporary of Lugard. Of this saint we are told that he was born in Ireland. He preceded St. Patrick as a missionary and lived to be one of his most intimate friends. It is related of his mother that in a dream she saw a star which fell into her mouth, and on referring the dream to the Druids for interpretation, she was told that the child she should bear would be famed for virtue to the end of time. It is said of the saint that he renewed life in a dead man. He went to sea on a rock which he caused to float, and so on, the record of his life being a continuous series of marvellous stories of this description. So that brings us to the end of part 6 of A Story of an Irish Sept. And sadly, that is where our journey is going to end with this book. I do encourage you, if you're interested, to download the book from the BrehonAcademy.org resource library and continue reading it. There's quite a lot more in it than what I've covered here. I believe there's maybe 15 or more chapters in the book. We've just covered 6. Now, I said at the start that I was going to be using pictures of the Battle of Clontarf reenactment, and I'm not sure if you were able to pick out my brother, but just in case you were wondering, this one here, he's been doing Viking reenactment for a very long time. I'd love to get him on. I've been coaxing him to come on and have a chat with us about everything he knows about the Viking era of Ireland. He has been in the Vikings TV show and other TV shows over the years. And I often like to poke fun that he is the Ara Ecta of this branch of the Flanagan clan. For those who are not sure what Ara Ecta is basically like the chieftain who avenges the insults of the clan. Ara is kind of a word that we would use for like a noble or a chieftain. And Ecta is like the one who avenged the insults. So that's Majahar. So folks, I'd like to thank you so much for being with me on this journey through the first 6 chapters of a story of an Irish Sept. I really hope you enjoyed it. I certainly enjoyed reading the book and putting these videos together. Plenty more in the pipeline for the Brehon Academy. So until next time, Slán go fáil.